Haswell. When most PC gamers think that name, they think of a great architecture that introduced the AVX2 instruction set, a nice performance leap compared to Ivy and Sandy Bridge CPUs, and overall great performance even in 2022. But what they don't think about is the integrated graphics included on them, which was the lowly Intel HD 4400 and the one we will be taking a look at today, the Intel HD 4600, and for good reason. It's integrated graphics, and with only 2GB of VRAM at our disposal, what did you even expect for performance? Well, we'll see if this reputation is entirely deserved, or if it can handle its own in the right workloads. The test system I have for us today is my previous main computer I used for about 6 years, from 2015 all the way up to 2021 when I upgraded to a Ryzen-based system. It's just a rather generic Dell Precision T1700 from 2015, with an Intel Core i7-4790 and 16GB of RAM, with its max amount of memory being double that. However, don't let the lack of a K in the name of the CPU fool you. It really is a great CPU. It kept me going for all that time, and as this is a non-Z series motherboard, we can't overclock the CPU anyway. However, keep in mind the chipset in this motherboard is none other than the somewhat unusual Intel C226 chipset, an industrial chipset that has, surprisingly, a PCI slot. Yes, a regular PCI slot, not Express or anything. And yes, I've tried inserting something like an Audigy 2ZS in there, and it does work under both Windows 7 and Windows 10 with it installed. Perhaps we'll make use of this slot as we mess around with this machine as time goes on. But I've dilly-dallied long enough. Let's see what the Intel HD 4600 can do in our various benchmarks. For our first operating system, we'll be using Windows 7, as it was the operating system that it came with, but we'll be trying a few operating systems in this video as we proceed on with it. To start us off, a 2013 integrated graphics solution is going to run a 2013 game, in this case, the 2013 Tomb Raider game. Medium settings gives us a disappointing frame rate of only 20 FPS in the benchmark, but turning them down to low settings gives us a much more reasonable 31 FPS. Let's move up by a year, in this case 2014's Metro Last Light Redux. Using low settings, it runs okay-ish, with an average of 16 FPS. Not looking good so far, but let's try something newer because why not? Moving another year ahead into 2015, we have the Grand Theft Auto 5 PC port. Keeping settings at the lowest yields us an average of about 20 FPS at 1080p, but if we turn the resolution down to 720p, we actually have a playable average of 30 FPS, which is very nice that this ran on the 360, and it's running about the same on this integrated graphics solution. Now that we know 720p is the key, and let's run none other than the 2016 Doom. Or at least, that's what I would do. Yeesh, even just 3 years after this came out, games are already failing to launch on this iGPU, but for some reason, I swear I could have gotten this one to work back in the day. Well, maybe that's just the OpenGL support not being good. The modern 3D Mark gives us a score of 7958 points in the low-end CloudGate test, and we also get 3520 points in the then mid-range Skydiver test, apparently enough to be a good result, and one that's actually slightly above the average for these HD 4600s. The problem is that neither of these tests are supported anymore, but let's try the one that still is, and the one test we can run is Firestrike. Not enough VRAM? Nah, I'm gonna give this one the benefit of the doubt. And the results are in! giving us a whopping 772 points in the test. Yes, just under 800. For reference, my current 1050 Ti scores higher, over 8 times as much. But hey, it worked, right? One last jump into the future with a 2019 title. That's right, Team Sonic Racing of all games, running with the lowest settings at over 30 FPS at 720p. This result genuinely stunned me, as I was not expecting it to be anywhere near playable. Indie and older games, of course, run absolutely fine. Ty the Tasmanian Tiger's PC port, which I did a development history of a few years ago, ran fine with low settings, and so did the Night Dive Turok remaster, to name a few. And to cap us off, can it run Crysis? Well, at max settings in 720p, we get an average of 20 FPS, so kinda? Even when turning down the settings to high, we get little difference in performance. Dropping our resolution down to 858 by 480 yields us a much more playable 35 FPS average, proving yet again that it's our resolution at fault, or really, just the 2 gigs of VRAM. But this is Windows 7. Why not take on Windows 10 or 11 and make it face off against DirectX 12 or Vulkan titles like Strange Brigade or Red Dead Redemption 2? Well, to put it bluntly, you're gonna need to do some trickery to get those APIs working. But we'll get back to that. But that isn't all the operating systems that this machine can handle though. Our next operating system to take on after this is Windows XP? More specifically, we're using a modified version of Windows XP known as the Delta Edition, created by Sky Weeb on Twitter. Please check her out in the link below. This modification aims to restore the Whistler Beta 2 aesthetic of the operating system's development, while still supporting Service Pack 3 and all its updates. As for our hardware, while Intel did not officially support the regular editions of Windows XP with official chipset drivers, they did provide special drivers for the Embedded POS Ready 2009 edition of XP, better known as the edition of Windows XP that was supported until April 2019, thanks to some clever tweaks by some hardware hackers. These special XP drivers allow us to have full chipset functionality with this operating system. You'll need to use SDI to install it though. But how well does it run that era of games? Quite well. A quick rundown of what 3D Mark results we have. 2001 has a score of 24,847, 2003 a score of 13,365, 2005 9143, and 2006 5548. As for the real games, Doom 3 at max settings runs quite well with an average of exactly 60 FPS, which was off to a promising start for XP benchmarks. Serious Sam was next with an average of only 25 FPS, which seems suspiciously low for a game that old. However, dropping the resolution to 720p netted us a much more reasonable 45 to 50 FPS average, at least in the first demo. The second demo, featuring lots of grass, seems to hold back our HD 4600 to only 27 FPS, and the third was all over the place. Source Engine games are next. Using Counter-Strike Source's benchmark, it yields us an average of 114 frames per second, but the opening scene of Mirrors slows our frames down dramatically, down to the 50s sometimes. Half-Life 2 proper, more specifically the original 2004 version, does still average over 60 FPS though, usually in the 70s to 80s for outdoor sections and triple digits for more closed-in sections. On to later era XP titles, with 2006's Need for Speed Carbon giving us an average of 50 to 60 FPS, at the max settings and a 1280 by 1024 resolution. Not bad stuff. Even late era titles like Call of Duty World at War run decently with an average of 25 to 30 FPS on max settings at 720p in both the campaign and the Nazi Zombies mode. If you turn down the settings a bit, namely textures to medium and most of the advanced effects off, it runs a lot better, staying above 50 FPS for the most part. For Windows XP gaming, The HD 4600 iGPU is definitely no slouch for the time period, but it can definitely be better in the later era titles. Now back to tackling that DX12/Vulkan problem. While the HD 4600 does technically support DirectX 12, its feature level set is only DX 11.1 internally, so brand new, true DX12 games do not run at all on the HD 4600, and Vulkan isn't supported on Windows 10 and 11 either. Emphasis on Windows though. And this is where Linux comes in, the age-old reliable alternative that can prove very handy for computers even older than this one. Luckily, under Linux, of which I'll be using KDE Neon for this session, the HD 4600 drivers support the original 1.0 Vulkan specifications. But before we take on games containing that API, let's try some games that we can easily download without going through Steam, starting with Super Tux Kart. And even this little game struggles with the max settings in 1080p. Unlike Windows though, for some reason we cannot run at 720p in full screen, and when trying other resolutions, my capture card treats it as a window. The most we can hope for is turning down the settings, and that still only nets us 30 FPS, proving once again our VRAM is the issue. But the good news is that 3D Pinball Space Cadet can work flawlessly with enhanced scaling to boot, using a special reverse-engineered version made for Linux distributions. On to the good stuff now. Using Valve's Proton compatibility layer, we can run various Windows games under Linux almost as well as Windows. And because Vulkan is now natively supported, let's take on Doom Eternal, shall we? Not supported. Get that out of here. 0 FPS? Now that's how the pro gamers do it. Not even playing it at all. How about Strange Brigade? Under both DX12 and Vulkan. How many frames do we get here? Surprisingly, a number above 0. 19 according to the in-game benchmark. But even that's been nullified by the bloom effect going completely haywire here, meaning that it's still unplayable even with our very much lowered standards by this point. Oh, and the DX12 executable didn't even work. It just defaults to the Vulkan executable anyway. Oh, and I didn't even bother with Wild West Simulator 2018. It was never gonna run well anyway. But why do we not get games launching or having so many issues even though we now have Vulkan? Well, remember when I said Vulkan 1.0 was supported? That basically amounts to it just existing here. And as it clearly states in the display driver, Haswell Vulkan support is very much incomplete. And really, that's the result we all expected when I set out on this project. It wouldn't run new games well at all, even from the time of its release in 2013. The CPU is still very much capable though, especially with the XP era stuff holding its own nicely, and thus concludes our adventures of the Intel HD 4600 running programs and operating systems Intel never once intended. Perfect material for this channel's sense of silliness taking hardware to strange places. I think I'll keep messing with this Precision T1700 desktop though, and perhaps we'll even put in that Audigy 2 ZS again in the future. This computer needs an optical drive filled after all. Well, thank you for watching.